I recently resigned as the vice chairman of the Postal Board of Governors when it became clear to me that the administration was politicizing the Postal Service, with the Treasury Secretary as the lead figure for the White House in that effort.
That was David Williams, and last April, he actually resigned from the Postal Service's Board of Governors in protest of the new Postmaster General's actions within the post office. Of course, that's Louis DeJoy. Now he's testifying before the Congressional Progressive Caucus about how Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin and DeJoy tried to exert their influence over mail operations and the finances involved with the post office. So let's listen in on a little more of what he had to say during his testimony.
By statute, the Treasury was made responsible for providing the Postal Service with a line of credit. The Treasury was using that responsibility to make demands that I believe would turn the Postal Service into a political tool, ending its long history as an apolitical public infrastructure. Clearly, the president was determined that the Postal Service should inflict harm on Amazon delivery by sharply raising parcel shipping prices on everyone by 400% or more. On the way to attacking a political foe, I was concerned that the American citizens would feel the shock of the price increase and that American supply chains would lose much of their value, harming businesses and our competitive position globally. The president was also scoffing at the Postal Service, calling it a joke, while a large number of our employees were dying daily as they struggled to perform our mission during a deadly pandemic. The president eventually admitted that he was withholding COVID-19 relief funds from the Postal Service so that it could not reliably enable voting in his upcoming election.
So this testimony was important because not only did Williams talk about the various ways in which Donald Trump tried to exert his own influence on the post office for political reasons, Donald Trump also tried to play a role in price hikes and increases for the post office because of its partnership with Amazon, which of course Donald Trump is incredibly salty and bitter about. But of course that's part of the story. The bigger part is how these actions are going to impact the way people are able to vote. It could potentially impact the outcome of the general election. And so David Williams did resign in protest of what was going on. He also said during the testimony, quote, the secretary, meaning Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin, has called over board members to provide instructions and requests and express his displeasure, which is really striking. I'm not sure I've run into that before, where one department is trying to run another department. Normally, you would simply reject the effort and report it to Congress. And in this case, Congress, of course, is aware of some of these actions that are taking place, which is why Williams not only testified before this particular committee, but today, Louis DeJoy testified before a Senate committee, which we'll talk about later in the show. But Cenk, before I get to more videos, I wanted you to jump in.
Yeah, there are two different issues here. One is a systematic dismantling the post office for both political and profit motives. So generally speaking, the right wing thinks destroying government is a good thing, making sure that it can't run. And part of the reason for that is that then you have to use private industry, which just totally coincidentally happens to be their donors. So if they dismantle the post office, FedEx, UPS, etc., will have so much more business. And obviously, look, if you had to just send a simple piece of mail, stamp is 55 cents, as you all know. FedEx, UPS, those private guys charge at a minimum around $9. So we're talking 20 times the cost. The amount of money that FedEx and UPS would make would be extraordinary. But they're not the only ones. And so that's where DeJoy comes into the picture. DeJoy has $30 to $75 million invested in post office competitors and contractors. Now, the contractor is relevant too, because if the post office can't do its regular job, oh, look at that. It has to contract out to DeJoy's companies. I mean, the corruption is unreal. unreal. The fact that Democrats have allowed any of this is just the saddest thing that's ever happened to our government. Now, the second issue is this particular election. And to me, this testimony is super interesting because Williams shows Mnuchin's involvement. Now, look, once they put DeJoy into place, they don't really have to touch it. DeJoy, for his own personal benefit, wants to dismantle the post office so he could make tens of millions of dollars. They could just let that go, right? No, Mnuchin being involved indicates it's a bigger emphasis on this election. Make sure that the post office is in shambles by election day.
In fact, in the next clip, Williams specifically talks about how involved Mnuchin was when it came to recruiting employees within the post office, specifically people like Louis DeJoy as Postmaster General, and the type of relationship that these types of nominees from the Trump administration had with Steve Mnuchin. So let's take a look at that next clip.
The Treasury Secretary also insisted that all Republican appointees on the Board of Governors and the Postal Regulatory Commission come to his office and kiss the ring and receive his blessing before confirmation. His continued contacts with him away from the full board continued issuing orders and expressing his approval and disappointment in their performance. The Secretary was keenly interested in labor agreements, postal pricing increases, and especially volume discounts being given to Postal Service's largest customers, Amazon and UPS and FedEx. The Postal Service replied to the early demands from the Secretary, explaining that the provisions he was asking for were illegal, but the concerns were ignored.
So he also elaborated on that point further, and this was reported by Common Dreams, where he was asked whether the board interviewed other qualified candidates for Postmaster General. Williams answered in the affirmative and characterized DeJoy as uniquely unfit for the job, recounting that he had to be coached through his interviews. Williams said DeJoy's appointment was pushed by John Barger, a board member and Republican donor who, according to Williams, helped DeJoy finish a number of sentences where he got stuck and explained to the board that what Mr. DeJoy meant during the presentation. So he was uniquely unqualified for this position. And with the help of one of the board members, he was able to get through that confirmation process. And so these are the things that were happening behind the scenes that the general public was completely unaware about. And unfortunately, if this fight doesn't continue and we don't get the changes that we need, it could have a significant impact on the outcome of the election. Just based on what we've heard from DeJoy during his testimony today, it's clear that hundreds of mail sorting machines have been taken out of service, and he is unwilling to put them back into service unless we really fight and we really ensure that happens.
So let's talk about the grotesque corruption in DC. DeJoy gave $2 million to Trump and the Republicans, and then they give him this job so that he can make way more than $2 million off the corruption. It's just so regular, commonplace. If they hadn't messed with the election, the Democrats would let them get away with it completely. They weren't saying anything about it. Look, what Williams resigned in April. He's been trying to bring this to Democrats' attention the whole time. People knew what Mnuchin were doing, but they never do anything about it because they think the corruption is good. They participate in the corruption. So they put as the head of the Board of the Governors, a Republican who is in charge of the senatorial committee fundraising for it. He raised over $100 million for Republicans, and he's on the post office board, and now he's the chairman of the Board of Governors of the post office. The Democrats approved that just a couple of months ago. Oh, come on, what are we doing here? What are we doing? This whole thing is just so rotten. Our government is just as corrupt as any in the world. The bags of money being exchanged and we're getting robbed on a daily basis. So that was, like I explained in the first part, that was a regular course of events anyway. But and then the election comes about, and then they have an extra incentive to dismantle everything right now before the election. So now, the other thing I get out of this, Anna, is, okay, now we know who the vice president is. We know the president is Jared Kushner, Now we know the vice president is Steve Mnuchin. So they're the ones running the government behind the scenes. Literally every story comes back to Kushner made this decision, Kushner made that decision, Mnuchin did this, Mnuchin ordered that other department that he has no business talking to at all, that is totally unrelated to Treasury. He told them to do this, he told them to do that. Those two guys are running the government. Pence is totally useless. And Trump is a big loudmouth idiot who's like, oh, me do what? Me no like brown or black people. Bleh. That guy can't manage his way out of a wet paper bag. So Kushner and Mnuchin have taken over. It's not that they're in opposition to what Trump is asking. They're basically executing what Trump generally wants, but they are definitely running the government.
Right. I mean, like they see their position of power as a unique position that puts everything in this country up for grabs for themselves, for their personal businesses, for their personal wealth, for their political agenda. And we see it carried out over and over again. We saw it carried out when it came to the CARES Act, and where a lot of that small business money ended up. A lot of donors and friends and pals of the Trump administration ended up qualifying for that money when all these small businesses desperately needed it and were unable to secure that funding. So this is part and parcel of who the Trump, or what the Trump administration is really all about. They don't really see this position of power as an opportunity to better the country or look out for the best interests of Americans, but rather the best interests of themselves. And to me, the most alarming part of the testimony that Williams gave is in this next clip, where he talks about the damage that's already been done to the post office.
We're now seeing the infrastructure cuts that are destroying the Postal Service's commitment to service delivery standards, and the beginning of the price increases that the president has threatened. The White House has admitted that steps taken to assure that Americans cannot vote in the next presidential election without exposing themselves to disease at the height of a deadly pandemic. I resigned from the Board of Governors because I was convinced that its independent role had been marginalized, and that representations regarding an independent postal service for the nation were no longer truthful. I felt the public was owed the truth in this matter.
So Williams also served as an inspector general for the post office, and he felt that that role was essentially, ineffective because of how politicized things had become and how involved the Trump administration had become in the operations of the post office. And the scariest part is, he really did emphasize the damage that's already been done by drop boxes being picked up, by more than 600 mail sorting machines that are desperately needed in order to handle the influx of ballots, mail-in ballots, how those have been taken out of service, and how unlikely it is that they'll be put back in service. And so, I give him a lot of credit for stepping down from that job. I mean, we call out Trump's administration all the time for, putting out these anonymous leaks while remaining cowardly enough to continue working for the administration. You have this man now, Williams, who came out and said, no, I'm gonna step down and I'm gonna speak out, and I'm glad he's doing that. But now it's really up to Democrats to be ruthless in fighting back against the Trump administration and against Louis DeJoy to ensure that those mail sorting machines are put back in service, and that drop boxes are also put back in place so people who want to vote by mail can easily do so.
There's almost no chance they'll be able to do that. The idea of the Democrats fighting hard, I mean, you're gonna have to rely on Rashida Tlaib and Bernie Sanders and AOC and stuff, but Pelosi and Schumer don't have that kind of fight in them. Oh, if you're gonna fight a progressive politician like Ed Markey, then Nancy Pelosi the lion, and that's the person you want in that fight. But you're fighting a Republican, little kitty cat. So they're not gonna fix a goddamn thing before the election.
Thanks for watching The Young Turks, really appreciate it. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. You'll get to interact with us more. There's live chat emojis, badges. You've got emojis of me, Anna, John, JR. So those are super fun. But you also get playback of our exclusive member-only shows and specials right after they air. So all of that, all you gotta do is click that join button right underneath the video. Thank you.